To Gardening Unplugged. My name is Jeremy Schmidt.
I'm Zac Hill. I'm the plant records and taxonomist here at Juniper Level Botanical Garden.
And we love Trilliums.
Yes.
We love Trilliums so much that we have how many taxa of Trillium in the garden now?
I think we have about 1,600 taxa, 1,600 clones, about 35 or 40 species in the garden here.
So we're pretty much crazy about them. What we want to do today is we're going to just walk through, be pretty fast paced. We want to cover as many species of Trilliums that grow in the south and southeast as possible. Many of which are native also in the south and southeast. In fact, I think all of the ones we'll cover are also native to this region, within a few hundred miles of here. So let's get started.
So this is Trillium ludovisianum. It's from generally Louisiana and along the Mississippi River into Mississippi. It is a fairly early species. This clone and then the one behind us are one of the first of the southeastern Trilliums to come up for us in the garden here. It's got tall, narrow petals that are usually bicolor. It does intergrade with cuneatum in Mississippi and forms some hybrid forms down there.
It's also good to know some of these early Trilliums, they're coming up in I've seen them come up in even late December. This one consistently comes up in mid to late January, and it still gets cold at that time of year. So one of the great things about, one of my favorite aspects of Trillium is that they can take it freezing. And when they freeze, they just curl up and they look awful, like that had to have killed them. And as soon as it thaws, they thaw and they're back in business immediately. So really down to somewhere, around 15, around 10 degrees, that's where some of them start to show some damage. But for the most part, they can take several hard freezes. 20 degrees is not usually a problem for them.
This one would have taken 15 degrees.
That's right. Yep. That's
in late January here when it was up.
That's a good point. This was full up, took 16 degrees, no problem. So that's one of the reasons we like Trilliums here, is it gives us something that looks fresh and spring-like even in the frozen parts of winter.
And just look at that one. It's brownish, and we've got something from the same genetics, I believe. This is the same.
Yeah, I think it's the same collection trip and probably site. Yeah, so the petal color of ludovisianum is quite variable, but both of these are certainly within a rather typical gradient, correct? Okay. But one thing you see that also varies in situ, in their natural situation, sometimes the same genus and species, even if they look almost the same, sometimes they offset and sometimes they just don't very much, like the first one that we looked at. This was a great offsetter, which to me, as a gardener who just can't stop gardening, I want to be able to share those really cool plants with other people. And so these great offsetters like this, that's something you can take a shovel and nip a little piece off and give to your neighbor or your friends or someone you don't like, because you know that if you give them a Trillium, they'll be hopelessly addicted too. and that's it. So we like offsetting clones when we can find them. That's a good one, yeah.
You want to do this one?
Sure, I can do this one. This is my gateway plant. This is obviously the genus, but specifically the species that got me hooked on plants as a young kid in central Illinois. This is a much different strain than what's in central Illinois, but Trillium recurvatum is what got me hooked on plants. This specific clone and this strain is from Arcadia, right?
Yeah.
Is that Nacogdoches?
Nacogdoches County, Texas.
Yep. And for whatever reason, again, I just talked about how we love offsetting Trillium. Where I grew up, the Trillium, you'd get one or two little stalks coming up, and then it would run, and then you'd get another stalk. You wouldn't have a cluster of beautiful Trillium recurvatum. You didn't see that in central Illinois genetics, but you take that to Nagadoches and they consistently offset, and they offset tightly. So we've really enjoyed this. Not only that we can take offsets and share with people, but they produce seed prolifically, and we can grow this strain up to flowering size, seed collected from the garden, grown here in an outdoor production area, and then offered for sale.
They do that quite fast.
Yes, they do. It's
4 years from seed to bloom.
Yep, 4 or 5 years from seed, and yeah, we got a lot of them.
Here we have a Trillium lancifolium Black Panther, which is extremely dark in leaf pattern. There are very few spots. Normally it's the reverse. You've got a few dark patches, but this one just seems to have an enormous amount of black patches. And this is a Florida one, right? A1NC059.
Yeah, this is going to be a shotgun wedding seedling.
Yeah, so that's out of our. It's a population from Florida that crossed with.
Is it Georgia, Tennessee, or
Alabama?
It's a much more northern. So you had something from Florida crossed with something from 200 miles or more north, which we named the strain Shotgun Wedding. And then out of that, and we have, I would say, 4,000 to 6,000 seedlings in the ground of that strain. One of those is like, wow, that one is very different. And so we selected it based upon that. We're also very fortunate that it's a great offsetter. So we have taken divisions of this now. I think we first took divisions 4 or 5 years ago, and we've already been able to once or twice offer it for sale. To where we actually have enough to share. And it's very easy to divide. You just put a shovel in it, rip it up, and throw it back in the ground. The key is don't let the roots dry out. That's a very important part of transplanting Trilliums. They are dormant with roots, and they're slow to rebuild roots if they're removed. So protect the roots when you dig them up and move them, but other than that, they're pretty easy.
They grow from a rhizome, just similar to iris or Solomon seal.
I would say, a classic bearded iris rhizome. Shrink that way down, and it's kind of has that same ribbing on it.
Put it underground.
And underground, yes. It's subterranean, whereas the iris, we see them above ground. But yeah, plant it 2 inches under your soil, mulch it, water it in good, and you've got a great shade garden plant.
And when do you think the best time is to transplant Trilliums from the garden to do this?
I don't know, Zach.
I mean, it's actually easiest to move them when they're up and growing and in full bloom.
Yep.
Transplant really well. They're about to send out a new flush of roots.
Yep.
As they finish flowering, they're sending out a new flush of roots. So whatever roots you damage digging them now will be replaced pretty fast at this point in the year.
Yeah.
When we go out in the wild to look at Trilliums, we'll see populations that don't necessarily match the books as to what is supposed to be there. This Trillium here is something that most people would consider to be within the cuneatum complex as a general rule. But it seems to be almost like Ludovicianum from Louisiana, but not quite. It's within the Savannah River drainage itself. It's an earlier bloomer. They seem to just jump right out of the soil and want to bloom. They also seem to attract a different pollinator than cuneatum planted side by side when they're in full bloom. They'll be covered in these little flies that come to this plant that smells sort of yeasty and beer-like, where cuneatum in its type locality is like juicy fruit chewing gum. Very sweet and fragrant.
The cool thing, I mean, this will end up being a new species of Trillium. There's really no doubt. But probably not just one. So even in the same county, we found, I'd say, 6 distinct forms in 7 different populations or 5 distinct forms. So how that all shakes out taxonomically, you know, we're just learning ourselves. What we do know is that this is distinctly a new species, and when I say this, I mean a whole broad range of populations within a very small space. So we're very excited.
But it could be about a 60-mile range. We found some up the savanna even further north, about 70 miles, that were blooming at the same time in the wild. They've continued that trend in cultivation, and they attract the same pollinators. So despite being, you know, probably 500-600 feet higher in elevation and 70 miles north, it seems to be the same thing, which was cuneatum.
Yeah.
So
We decided to join.
Well, come on in. Trillium gracillae, which is another one of those deep south ones, right, Zach? That's
this is along the Texas and Louisiana border. It's got very narrow petals that are sort of very upright.
well, it's sort of closed right now.
Yeah, well, they're not blooming. They're one of the first to come up, but they're one of the last for us to actually open and bloom. Usually open towards the end of March, early April.
Which is an interesting characteristic about Trillium. It's one of those little things that most people don't talk about or see, but having grown so many side by side, some species of Trillium, like Fetidissimum is probably the best example, which we'll look at a little later. They come up super early, but then they just sit there with their leaves out, but they don't open their flower until much later. However, some like cuneatum or the unnamed species that Zach just looked at, as soon as they come up and that flower bud gets up, that flower bud opens as soon as possible. So is that a response to what pollinators are available? Who knows? But it's just those cool little things. After you've been excited for Trilliums as long as we have, that you start noticing, and it just gets you excited about more things about Trillium. Little mysteries.
I'm sorry I joined late, but how long do the flowers tend to bloom on them?
They stay aesthetically attractive usually for what, 2 to 3 weeks?
2 to 3 weeks, depending on how warm or cool it is in the spring.
Yep, that'll.
The foliage stays up until May to June. It's looking a little worse for wear by that point, but it's done everything it needs to do. It's setting its seed. The seed are ready by the end of June to be harvested and squished into the ground near the plants.
Yep, or carried off by ants and yellow jackets. Yes.
So they are summer dormant.
They are very much summer dormant, except for some that come up really late, like Catesbii. Trillium Catesbii, a pedicellate species, one that has its flower on a pedestal. It doesn't come up here until April, and I've seen it up until October, just hanging out in Olmsted Park. So, cool plant. We'll keep going. We'll look at some more. Decipiens, which I guess means a deceptive trillium.
Yeah, deceiving trillium.
Yeah, so this is a Decepticon of Trilliums. It's deceiving in my opinion because it looks just like Underwood Eye, and if I had my taxonomic way, it would be Underwood Eye. What do you think, Zach?
No.
Okay, he disagrees with me. That's unfortunate.
It was described in 1975 by John Freeman out of Auburn, Alabama. He revised the genus. It was one of his big lifetime works. He named a grassley that we just saw in that same paper, and Fetidissimum in that paper, and Decipiens, which had been known as a tall Underwoody eye. And turns out that it's its own thing. It's fairly distinctive at its type location, which is, there's a plant from that over there along the Chattahoochee in Georgia and Alabama. It just sort of follows the Chattahoochee up to about just north of Fort Gaines, I believe, is where the Fort Gaines area. So it's got greenish flowers to a red. Jeremy actually agreed that it might be a species when we saw it in the wild in 2020.
Yep.
Along some creeks that feed into the Chattahoochee. So it was the first time we'd actually seen type material that was like, oh yeah, this actually is a species.
And
instead of the stuff from central Georgia, which is probably also something new, but not quite Underwood Eye and not Decipiens either.
yeah, now it is seeing it. Zac mentioned its type location. That means going to the population that the botanist said, I'm going to take a collection of this, I'm going to press it, and I'm going to study it further, and then I'm going to publish it as a new species. And so while a population might have a large range geographically, that type location, that's the original right there. That's the original. So everywhere else, the population might change a little bit. For example, some Decipiens have much narrower leaves than that. Just a sharper, crisper looking thing, very upright, very out with the leaves. Whereas this one's a little bit floppier. And then they'll get floppier yet, and then it gets so floppy that you're like, well, is that still a Decipiens? And I'd say the jury is out on that. So it's really cool. But that's taxonomically, that's why knowing where a type location and seeing that is very important, because you get that central point then to go out from as you continue seeing more and more plants with the same name.
And so Decipiens differs from Underwood Eye, and that the bracts, the actual what people think of as leaves, which are just modified bracts. They're not really leaves.
These are not leaves. You're not seeing a leaf here, right? There are no leaves. Where are the leaves?
The leaves sheath the stem underground.
It has underground leaves. Yeah, so its leaves are down underground somewhere doing absolutely nothing of importance.
Protection.
That's a stem.
But Decipiens, the bracts are 2.5 to 3 times the length of the stem when the flowers are open. Whereas Underwood Eye, the tips are generally touching the ground or can touch the ground if you bend them down.
Yeah, this one's going to be close because it's not fully elongated, but if I bend these leaves down, they don't touch the ground. Whereas generally Underwood Eye, which we haven't seen yet, but we will, if you do that same thing, they'll usually touch the ground. And that is the strongest, it's the strongest, most easily noticeable difference.
Underwood Eye is a shorter appearing plant.
Yeah, they can be wider, but
it's got longer leaves, bracts, than Decipiens, which is a taller, shorter bracted thing. Generally, they don't clump as a species, but we have found a few in populations that show some tendency to clumping that we are waiting to see.
Oh yeah.
If divisions continue to show that trait, which will make it a lot easier to offer you these plants as a clone. So
let's find more Trillium. One of the coolest, again, very well in Alabama, mostly in Alabama,
southern Tennessee, and a little bit. It's in a little bit into Mississippi and barely into Georgia.
What's cool about this, well, what I like about it, a lot of them clump really well in a garden. And it seems like Staminium, and we're talking about Trilliums for the South, what we have found, at least what I've found, but it's been proven right now in some of our outdoor production areas, is that they can actually tolerate mostly full sun as long as they stay moist. So this one's actually, it's pretty shady, but it's still offsetting really well. When this opens, Zac can probably explain the flower better than I can, but it's extremely unique.
The flower petals open upright and then drop and twist like they're actually twisted 1.5 to 2 times on each one, and I think we decided it was counterclockwise on everything we looked at.
Yeah, we looked at like dozens of pictures, both our own and every Staminium picture we could find online, and it appears that the petals twist the same direction every single time on every single plant. Which begs the question, if you planted one in the southern hemisphere, would it go the opposite direction? I don't know. Jury is out.
Trillium decumbens, which we haven't seen yet, we can see that here in a bit, were found along the fall line in Georgia. The botanists in Georgia said, oh, this is just Trillium decumbens. Tom Patrick, who was pretty well known for being into the upright pedicellate species, he really said, oh, it's just decumbens, will go on with whatever. So then some other researchers started looking into it and discovered that it was a new species that looks very similar to decumbens, which means decumbens means creeping or reclining, basically. This creeps along the stem, comes up and lays along the ground. It's actually its closest relative is Staminium, even though the petals look nothing like it. It's only found in 2 known localities right now, one in central Georgia near Macon, and another population up near UGA. But we went and found this at the type location in 2017.
I think that's right.
The wildlife management area it is in is managed for wild hogs, which are the #1 enemy of trilliums because they eat them. They love to eat the rhizomes. And this management area is managed for a specific type of wild hog that was brought in from Europe in the 70s by this guy who had great ideas that this was going to be a great hunting.
Well, it is. I mean,
it is.
You get to shoot stuff. That's, that's great.
It has practically wiped the type location out. There's a very few left. They're having to keep them fenced off and have metal grate around these plants. It's a very interesting plant, and it smells like horse poop.
It does indeed, yes.
And it had a very interesting common name from the botanists named it.
Vernacular, yes.
But it was described as a new species in 2018 by a friend of ours, Aaron Floden from University of Tennessee in Knoxville, who's now at Missouri Botanic Garden.
There's still new species in our backyards. This is not some exotic place. This is good old Georgia, right near a Frito-Lay factory. And it's there's a new species. And one thing that Zac and I found when we're in the presence of something so rare or so different is that often other plants, even if they are the same genus species as we know, are also a little different. So in this same population, there is what is probably best described as Trillium decipiens or maybe Underwood Eye, but it's different. It's not like other populations that we see where we haven't found Trillium delicatum. And there's a Trillium lancifolium, which is likely to be split from lancifolium and become a new species, but it's very different. We found one just growing right through the delicatums, and it was 17 inches tall with this little teeny tiny top. It
was knee high.
It was huge, but with the little tiny top. It was little, but so you see that a lot when we were Tennessee state line. You get these really cool populations of multicolored flowers on a Trillium that would normally have red flowers. Sometimes they're just a little different.
We stopped 7 miles before we got to the state line. They were completely done in bloom. We drive 7 miles up, go up a little higher, and they are in full bloom peak, where the ones were a week and a half past peak in northern Georgia, Alabama.
Yeah, so they'll change, and that's the beauty of documenting populations of plants, like their physical address, right? Their mailing address. As you go door to door, so to speak, this population, 20 miles down the road, this population, so on and so forth, you can watch them change. You get out, you look at them, you take pictures of them, you get back in the vehicle, you go 20 miles, you get out, take pictures, and then you zoom in a little and you realize that like Zac said, it's 3 weeks different in blooming, or maybe it's got a little fuzz on the stems, or instead of 0.1% of this population having an aberrant flower color, you're at 1 or 2% or 5% for whatever reason seem to have a different flower color. And you can follow basically veins of this that also happen to be our highways, and it's pretty cool stuff. And what we like to do then is when we represent those populations in the close quarters of 28 acres, something like that, then 20 miles down the road is 10 steps one way or the other. And so you can see all that unfold in a garden. And that's another reason why we just love growing trilliums, is we get to enjoy the entire botanical diversity of the Southeast all together in one place.
Look at the
yeah, maculatum, all right. Again, some plants have very widespread populations. So we've just gone to Florida. This is Trillium maculatum. Maculate, of course, means spotted, right? Okay.
It's a spotted trillium.
Spotted trillium. Even though a lot of them have spots, but
yeah.
This is a very southern population. This is one of those that comes up ridiculously early, and with a normal winter takes ridiculous damage.
Or ridiculously late, since it's usually up in December.
Yeah, yeah. So, and I mean, Zac actually took some good pictures of this one when we had our cold snap. The thing was just curled up and totally frozen solid, right? It was cartoon-like. It was so grotesque. And then a nice warm day, anything above freezing, it thaws out like nothing happened.
Yeah.
But again, you get down, you know, in the low teens or 10 or 9. What we often do in Raleigh, it will take damage. That's a little bit too much for it. However, there are maculatums growing a couple 100 miles north of that, and they're going to come up 3, 4, 5 weeks later. And so they're able to generally miss the coldest part of winter and be just fine. So, but we thought we'd show you this. Zac, could you show them how the petals are very telling on this plant?
So Trillium maculatum has very spatulate petals. It's very much wide at the tip. Its widest point is within the upper bit of its petals. It's got a very clawed base, where cuneatum would be more wedge-shaped and wider at the base and have a more even taper at the tip. So maculatum is pretty easy to tell in the wild because it generally follows this pattern of petal shape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even when they're the plant shape, the leaf shape is much different than that in some places, but that petal is very telling.
What about the different colored flowers?
That might be an age thing.
Yeah, it's either an age thing or it could be a slight variation.
Mm-hmm.
There are yellow and red and yellow flowered forms of Trillium maculatum. I think we have one luteum.
Got one over there.
Mm-hmm. The 41.
Yep.
But they named maculatum forma luteum not to be confused with Trillium luteum, which is a yellow trillium as well. And there's also a forma simulans, which has a red base and a creamy yellow tip, and the red sort of follows up the middle of the petal. Mm-hmm. It's really pretty. Its type location was outside of Charleston. And we did have some material of that at one point from the type location that Tony collected in the 90s, I believe.
And now it's gone.
Do they get seed pods?
Huh?
Do they get seed pods?
Yes. Yeah, they're gonna, right now they're just coming into full bloom. I'm not sure if they're even dropping pollen yet.
Okay.
Then they'll do their thing. They close up shop, the petals eventually fall off, and then in late June to early July is when the seed pods are completely ripe and begin to crack, not at the top like you think of a seed pod breaking open, but Trillium seed pods never break at the top. They crack at the base just a little bit. And once that happens, the ants and the yellow jackets, they all line up. Well, I mean, they fight over these things. They go in, they invade it, and they grab those seeds, and it's off to the races. Trillium seed have something on them that is shared by other kinds of plants in the world, but It's called an eliosome, which means oil body. It quite literally translates exactly like that. And that's a little sweet sugary goober that's stuck to the side of the seed. And the ants and the yellow jackets, that's pretty much crack for them. And they will get that, and then they will carry it off until either somehow they pry the thing loose, or they despair and they leave it alongside of the road. And that's usually where it germinates. And so that's the main carriers of the main dispersal mechanism for trillium seed is our ants and yellow jackets. So yellow jackets are good for something.
Nothing is more telling than grabbing a seed pod of a trillium and feeling that it's a little more soft and empty than you were hoping it was. And then you're like, oh, we've got to figure out where the ants took the seeds.
You'll see that in a year or so. You can actually, sometimes you'll see like a line of seed. So, of seedlings rather. Okay, what's next? We got
You got the liquid here behind us.
liquid. All right.
So, also in Freeman's paper in 75, he named this trillium here Trillium reliquum. It was known from 2 locations, near Augusta and then on the Chattahoochee, and nowhere else. It's one of the few trilliums that is on the endangered species list in the U.S. It should not be. It actually occurs in a band across central Georgia, from just east of Augusta, across down through central Georgia and across into near Fort Gaines on the Chattahoochee and into Alabama. It sort of reclines a little bit, almost like decumbens. It's related to Underwood Eye and Decipiens. It's got a brownish red flower, sometimes with a little bit of yellow. It can also have solid yellow forms. It's an easy place. There's easy places to see this plant. It's along I-20, the South Carolina Welcome Center. It's in the picnic area.
Yeah, right on the border.
Along the highway, this plant is growing. So they when they put I-20 in, they bulldoze.
Oh man, I didn't even want to think about it. But now you can drive over all those ghost trillium to find living trillium. One of the things I like about reliquum, well, 2 things. When it first comes up, the backs of the leaves, as it's still all curled up in a point like this as it emerges, it's this like purple color. Now that's just about gone, but you see the last little bit of that tint going to green. But another thing I like about reliquum is it has its pattern, somehow it has a slight blur to it. So a lot of trilliums, the pattern is sharp. If you look closely at where the olive goes into the silver, it's a pretty sharp transition. But for whatever reason, and maybe it's just me, this one seems like it's just a little bit blurred. And that was the first thing that struck me about it. This is first trillium I ever saw outside of Recurvatum. This is the first one I saw in the wild, right?
10 years ago.
Yeah, 10 years ago today or next week, yeah.
And it was along the side of I-20. And we were driving this little road, and I said, there were trilliums, and we were going probably 55 miles an hour.
Remember, I was driving though, so probably faster.
And we turned around, and sure enough, there were Trillium reliquums, and this is actually from that trip.
Yeah, yep. That's when I first got to see, that was my first real botanizing trip to where I could see plants growing where they came from in relation to other plants, and it's just total mind-blowing. That's
yeah, I mean, these are growing 25 to 30 feet from cars speeding by at 90 miles an hour headed towards Augusta.
And they'll never know. They'll never know. It's a beautiful plant. Decumbens. This is the way they look in the wild. And I remember when the first time I ever saw this in the wild with Zac, the population, it was so dense that you couldn't walk without stepping on these things. And I remember it was painful.
It also couldn't walk because an F4 tornado had gone through the woods we were walking in 2 or 3 years prior to us being there that wiped out a 1.5 2 mile wide stretch of woods
It just clear cut it.
through
Yeah.
northern Alabama.
Yeah, that was hard to walk because of the down trees there, and then that other spot was hard to walk because there were so many of them. But this is Trillium decumbens, and it grows with other Trillium like what's commonly called cuneatum, but it probably won't be for long once we're done with it. We'll help publish it as a different species. But this is typical, that's what you see. And then occasionally things just get weird. And you get this massive form, which we've really enjoyed watching this. It's interesting, this massive form doesn't seem to offset very much, where others do seem to offset some. So again, that just those differences within the same population, some are very different.